Good morning, everyone. This is Michelle Hughes from Ageless and Timeless. Today, I have a very special guest. As I always say, always have special guests, but his name is Ryan Smith. And Ryan is the founder, one of the co-founders, I should say, of a company called TruDiagnostics, which is the company that many people are turning to these days to test their biological age, their DNA methylation, and all the markers for anti-aging that are becoming the most compelling in the longevity field today. So we're going to learn a lot today about all the markers for biological aging and how Ryan has spearheaded this effort. Is a very young man, but he has been at the forefront of this whole field, and epigenetics is what the field is kind of generally called, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So Ryan, welcome to our podcast this morning, and thank you for taking the time to join us and help us to learn more about what you do at TruDiagnostics. I'm going to give just a little bit of a bio on you, but I want you to fill in the blanks. So just a brief one, that Ryan did start out going to get his BS in chemistry, right, Ryan? Biochemistry?
Yeah, biochemistry, yeah.
Yeah, and then he decided to go to medical school, but then during medical school, he realized that he wanted to become get more into the pharmaceutical side, and the pharmaceutical side led him to the preventative medicine business, and he started a company called Tailor Made.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, certainly.
And that company grew to 80 million. It was a company that focused on basically peptides, right? Way before the time of peptides. So Ryan has always been kind of ahead of his time. So he's going to tell us more about all of those conquests that he's made by being there before everybody else. But Ryan, when you started out, you obviously knew what you wanted to do in the world of medicine, and then, or you thought you did, and then you realized that you had a calling that you needed to follow your heart, follow your mind. So tell us who and what guided you to those changes, because those are pretty monumental changes to start medical school and then drop out and then go into a whole different field that's related but not directly schooling. So can you give us a little bit of background on how you became the person that led the forefront at Tailor Made?
Yeah, certainly. I hate to say it without bearing the lead too much, but it was a lot of luck, quite frankly. I wish I could say it was all, intuitive design, but, I did my first 2 years of medical school, which is really most of the I would say, schooling portion, but got into that third year with the clinical portion and got really disillusioned, I think, with healthcare. I didn't think that I was doing much of a difference. In Kentucky, I was treating a relatively, I would say, chronic disease population and really just managing symptoms. And it was really, I would say, difficult because I didn't feel like, treating the symptoms. I certainly applaud that as a career field, but for me, it wasn't preventative enough. I think that at that point, we were just sort of seeing patients who were already in the sort of down stages of disease. So I knew I wanted to do something else, and really just got lucky with this field of pharmaceutical peptide development. A lot of my previous work in biochemistry had been in peptide and protein biosynthesis. So I had worked a lot with creating new products, both recombinant as well as some of those other pharmaceutical creation methods. And we saw an opportunity in the market, and we were lucky enough to hit it. And I think that at that point, a lot of people weren't familiar with even what peptides are or some of their applications. And the physicians that we were working with introduced me to a whole new side of medicine where things were really working preventatively, where they were trying to prevent disease before they were happening, focusing on optimization. And that shifted, I think, a lot of my concept of medicine. And I was lucky enough to have that experience.
Well, it's interesting because when you say the word pharmaceutical, immediately we think of all the drug companies and all the allopathic approaches, and to have been at the forefront of the pharmaceutical industry in the peptide world, and also, of course, in the preventative medicine, anti-aging rather than allopathic. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so generally we were doing some of these medications that we were doing, peptides that people might be familiar with, things like BPC 157, PT 141. None of these drugs were used or approved whenever we sort of were taking them to the market. And legally, that was only able to be done in a pharmaceutical compounding environment. And one that also, I should also mention, doesn't have any insurance-based reimbursement because these drugs are not approved. And so we really were focused on a cash pay market. And the people who are doing most cash pay medicine are people who are really doing preventative medicine before people have diseases, because that's insurance companies unfortunately don't oftentimes reimburse for healthy people who are looking to optimize their health. And so it really, this community was sort of a new community, but one that is very collaborative and very open to learning new and best techniques, very innovative. And so they were very receptive of all the things that we were doing. And as you mentioned, a lot of them were treating age as a primary outcome, because age is such a big risk factor for all chronic disease and death. And so it really had this preventative approach in a different philosophy of medicine. And I think that was really exciting. So again, just sort of got lucky because I didn't know this space of medicine even existed. I think if I had, I might have continued with the medical school experience. But unfortunately I didn't, and I was really lucky to find it.
Mm-hmm. So Ryan, what or who influenced you the most in your journey?
Yeah, I would say just a multitude of physicians as I was onboarding, learning about all the ways that they approach preventative medicine. There are too many to name. But I appreciate all the lessons in the many diverse areas that they've helped me with. And I think that, as we were going through all of these different peptide products, one of the things we realized was probably the biggest weakness was that a lot of them didn't have the data needed for FDA approval. And so one of the things we were always looking at was what are the best ways to actually quantify some of these health traits and health improvements in short timelines. And that really introduced me to this field of epigenetic methylation and these epigenetic clocks. And that really was what started, I would say, my vision for this company at TruDiagnostic. To be able to really use some of those tools in a variety of different ways, but particularly to quantify aging.
So I think we're going to take a deep dive right now. So let's just define some terms. Okay. So let's start with aging.
Yeah.
What is aging, and how do you qualify aging in terms of what TruDiagnostic does with aging?
Yeah. So I think that, most people, if they had to answer that question, would probably say that age is how long you've been alive, right? They would say that, from the moment that you've been born to now, that's age. However, I think that our philosophy of what age is very different. And I think that that's because of this concept of what we call phenotypic variation. And it might sound complicated, but everyone knows this idea. It's whenever you find out someone's age and you're shocked, right? You might say you meet someone, you think that they're 35 years of age, and you find out they're in their 50s, and you can be like, how is that possible? This person looks young, they're behaving young, they're physically functioning young, and then vice versa. The same people who you might see, and they say that they're 35, and you think that they're in their 50s. That difference, that phenotypic difference, is really what we would define as aging. And the reason for that is because aging, from a chronological perspective, how many times you've been around the sun, for instance, is a relatively arbitrary number to what makes a difference in our health. But even that arbitrary number is still the greatest predictor, the greatest risk factor of all other chronic disease risks. So that is what we're really trying to quantify. And we call those differences basically the difference of chronologic age versus biologic age. But that definition of biological age is much more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we want to dive into today, part of it. So, because that helps us to the baseline of what TruDiagnostics is measuring, and why you are ahead of the pack in terms of everything that you do in that field. So okay. So if we have the difference between chronological and biological aging, so would you dissect for us that difference in terms of what makes up the biological age of a person versus how many times they've been around the sun, which is the chronological age? We all know that the chronological age is just a number. That's what we all of us say. but let's understand that a little better. So, what are the markers, the biomarkers of biological aging that you use as part of your algorithm?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question, and one that I would say that there's not a lot of scientific consensus on. Even when we started our company, TruDiagnostics, most people recognized that there were 9 big hallmarks of aging. Things like epigenetic dysregulation, or nutrient sensing problems, or telomere length shortening. Those are a few, just to name a few. But even now, a few years later, only 3 years later since we first started TruDiagnostic, there are even 14 recognized hallmarks of aging. And so this definition of all the processes which tend to lose function as we get older can be what we call these hallmarks of aging. And this process is enormously complex. As we learn more and more about the body, we start to find more and more changes that relate to or are associated with our chronological age. But even more importantly, they're heavily associated with function. And this is why, for instance, we see people in their 60s with the same biomarkers as people in their 30s, but they have more diseases, is because we tend to lose the physiological function that of optimal as our body ages. And so this is a really hard process to quantify because aging biology is just so complex. But with that being said, the way that we can always judge it is by how predictive are these ways of quantifying age to negative outcomes. And so really, the history of these epigenetic clocks is a great way to sort of tackle this conversation and to talk about it. And really, these epigenetic clocks really started in 2013 by Dr. Steve Horvath at UCLA. And at first, they started to be used in a variety of ways, but really no health-related ways. So they started to be using, for instance, to quantify DNA at a crime scene to see how old someone was if they left their DNA there. That way, you could sort of narrow down your suspect list. They were used in European refugees. So, for instance, in the Syrian refugee crisis, as people started going in large numbers to Europe, they started to use this testing to see if people were adults or minors, and if they were minors, then they would be eligible for asylum. And so they started using it in a lot of strange ways, but they were still at that point in time predicting chronological age. And the problem with that is that the better that those clocks got, the closer they got to just your birthday, which is something we could ask for. We don't need an expensive test for. And so really in 2018, these clocks started to be a little bit different. They started to be trained to biological phenotypes. So things like that we know change with age, like your insulin sensitivity or your blood cholesterol markers, or even your telomere length, for instance. And these clocks we know are better because we know that they are more associated to aging outcomes. So if you're aging quicker than your chronological age, so you're older than your chronological age with this testing, you're going to be more at risk for all negative outcomes. And if you're younger with this testing than your chronological age, you're going to be protected from all of those same negative outcomes. And so one statistic I always like to use that was used in a presentation by Morgan Levine, another researcher who's very famous for these biological age clocks, is that if everyone in the world were to be 7 years younger biologically than their chronological age, we would be able to cut disease in half. 50% of people would no longer be sick.
Wow.
And that just gives you an idea of how much age plays a role into the development of these outcomes for us. And so I think that this is something that is actually very freeing for most people, because you do have the ability to control your biology to some degree. And by making improvements in the way that you function throughout the world, you can improve that biological aging process and prevent those outcomes. But in addition to that, prevent all these quality of life things that we tend to avoid and fear as we get older as well.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Epigenetic. From stem cell therapy to lifestyle coaching, Epigenetic is the perfect place to go for all your health and wellness needs. This health clinic is amazing at getting you personalized medicine and wellness that is unique to you. Use the code AGELESS and you'll get 20% off your first service with them. Go to www.Epigenetic.com to find out more information about these powerful methods.
So epigenetics is, again, to me, the biggest topic and the most exciting topic here, because the way I traditionally explain it to people is by saying that most people are very familiar with genetics, right? Your sequence of DNA that gives you the code of your body. And this has been around for a long time, but epigenetics is much newer. And so if every cell in your body has the same DNA, like your lungs, your heart, your skin, the question is, how do those have different behaviors, right? How does your skin know how to behave like a skin cell? And how does your heart know how to behave like a heart cell? And the way that it does that is by sort of the instructions, not just of the DNA, but what DNA is actually turned on or turned off. And those markers, or those on or off switches, are sort of what we call epigenetics in a really simplified way. So in case of what we're measuring DNA methylation, which is a little bit of basically a methyl group, a carbon group, which is attached to your DNA, which is sort of the off switch for your DNA. So when you have an attached methyl group, you're basically not transcribing that DNA. Your DNA is not being produced to mRNA, which then creates proteins and peptides that make up the infrastructure of your body. And so what we're sort of measuring at each of the gene locations that we test is the percentage of methylation. What is the percentage of that off switch? And so we're doing that at right around 1 million locations in your genome. And so that is really what we're measuring. And the good thing about that is that it can be changed by almost everything that you do in your life. So your methylation patterns can change as a result of your diet and nutrition, as a result of supplements or medications that you take, as a result of your fitness activity. Even your stress and your social interactions with individuals will change these patterns. So we can start to read these patterns in a variety of ways, even beyond aging. So right now, there are already algorithms that we can use to tell you how much you smoked across an entire lifetime, how much you're currently drinking, for instance. We can even tell you about pollution markers. How much pollution have you been exposed to in your DNA? We can even predict when you're going to die, and this is already actually being used by life insurance companies to quote you a premium on how much they should be charging you. And so there's a lot of really cool applications for this. You can track progression of cancer, detect cancer before any other method even. So a lot of implications will affect a lot of different fields of medicine, in agriculture, and really everything you can imagine. But we're really focused on aging. And to do that, we create these epigenetic age clocks where we take that data, that percentage of methylation at each of the locations on your genome, and we use it to try and predict outcomes. In this case, we really try and quantify your biological aging by looking at all of the different factors that we can, and using computer learning and machine learning to interpret that data in ways that humans just haven't been able to in the past.
Mm-hmm. So when somebody does your test, can you actually pinpoint those lifestyle factors when you're coming up with the DNA methylation outcome? Can you the things that you've just mentioned, are they possible to pinpoint with every individual person so that they get kind of a excuse me for saying tailor-made, customized understanding of what they need to do to improve their epigenetic clock or their biological age?
Yeah, certainly. So we can certainly, and we already report on behaviors like smoking and drinking, for instance. And one of the reasons is that one of the best things you can do to improve your biological age is reduce bad behaviors or things that are going to hurt your aging process. And I think it's pretty definitive now that things like smoking and drinking definitely hurt that process and are generally not good for you. There was a time early in this type of research where we thought maybe some drinking was good for you, but now I think we've sort of switched that. So we can certainly quantify that. We can also quantify things like your inflammatory markers. How inflamed is your body as a marker, which we know increases, I would say, aging across the board. And very soon we're going to be even start to add resolution into the aging of different organ systems. So for instance, how is your brain aging versus your heart versus your liver versus your skin or your immune system? And so we're starting to get even much more resolution into those aging signals to tell you what's really driving your own aging. And for us, we always adopt a philosophy of you can't manage what you can't measure. And so what we're really trying to do is to give the best in class way to measure this process of biological aging so that people can really start to find out ways they can reverse it and what's working for them.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience, how many patients have you so far treated for the biological age result?
Yeah, we've tested over 25,000 patients now, which is
25,000.
25,000.
Does that make you the largest of the diagnostic testing for biological aging?
Oh yeah, certainly. We are the largest private epigenetic database in the world now, and we've done that in just 3 years. It's been it's such a new field that but we also have tested a lot of scale. We test, as I mentioned, almost 1 million different locations in the genome, which also helps improve resolution of these algorithms and find out even more patterns about what's connecting your aging to these different behaviors. And we've started to do a lot of different analysis with that. We've done a lot of interventional trials, which I'm sure we'll talk about things that we can learn about how to reverse your biological aging. We've also done things like looking at smoking and drinking or marijuana use to figure out how it's changing some of those expression markers in your genomes. What genes is it upregulating? What genes is it downregulating? We've been able to quantify the immune system in really, really amazing ways to look at how our immune system is aging over time. And all of these have applications into almost every area of health. And so I think if there's one big takeaway from anyone that's listening now, it's certainly that I'd love to put emphasis on age as something that you can have an impact on in your own health. But secondarily to that, I think it's that epigenetics as a platform will be just as robust, if not bigger, than genetics, because it's very, very informative, but it's also changeable. And so instead of taking a test once in a lifetime with your DNA, which you can't change, you can actually measure your epigenetic expression, implement solutions, and then retest to see if those solutions are actually helping or hurting.
When you talk about the genes, because a lot of people have the misconception that you cannot change your genes, that your genetic expression is who you are, and that's what your parents gave you, and there's no way to change that. And yet that does alter the premises of your business if you were to believe that. So how do you dispute the claim that you cannot change your genes, and how do you prove that with what you do?
Yeah, so I would agree. You can't change your genes. That's hard to do, but you can change the way your genes are expressed. And that is what the important part is, because I always like to use the example of some cancer-related genes. So, for instance, you have genes in your body which we call tumor suppressor genes. These are meant to suppress cancer, and when they're activated, they're doing their job. They're suppressing cancer from developing, and that's great. But if those were to become deactivated, that would be a problem, because then you're not having the brakes on the system which is supposed to prevent cancer. And vice versa. Sometimes we have oncogenes, or genes that tend to proliferate cancers or growth. And some of those oncogenes you might want turned off more than usual. But if they get turned on, then that can be a problem. And so gene expression absolutely matters to the function of our body and our cells, and how this genetic information is used. Sometimes people liken it to hardware versus software, but like a computer system, where the DNA is the hardware. It's your computer. It's how it's set up. It's processing. It's RAM. It's how many gigabytes of storage. But the actual software, which is choosing what to use, is the epigenetics, which is sort of saying this needs to be turned on. This needs to be turned off. We're going to go in this direction or that. And so, although you might not be able to change your genes, you might be able to mitigate some of the genetic risk that you have through proper I would say treatment. And that treatment could be diet, lifestyle, nutrition. And that's really what we're trying to answer. So first, we're creating a way to predict or measure the risk. And then we're creating analysis to find out ways to reverse that risk. And so that's sort of the whole process: is first create the tool, and then secondarily find the ways to improve or to fix some of those deficiencies.
So do you allow the consumer to interact with your staff and to do the testing, or must they come through a medical professional to be able to take advantage of TruDiagnostic's algorithms?
So, age is actually in a weird place medically, because the FDA does not consider age as disease. And so as a result, we are able to do a lot of this testing to consumers directly. And that's great. We're able to quantify things like aging. However, we're not able to do some of the really advanced things that we can do on the back end, with our physicians, where we're able to predict things like diabetes risk, or obesity risk, or cardiovascular disease risk, or immune system dysfunction. And so we always recommend going through a physician, because you can get more data, and it's also easier to analyze. Some of the physician experience in this area might be able to give you really good recommendations on what to do. But it is also available as a consumer. And even in our consumer testing, we really prioritize education among everything. Usually we don't recommend any type of treatment unless it has studies that have been published on it. And that's another thing I think that makes TruDiagnostic very unique, is that all of our algorithms are published. And so this is really, really important, because if someone doesn't have a published algorithm, it's a little bit like going to a fortune teller, we sometimes say. You can choose to believe them, but it's always better to have evidence. And so all of our algorithms are published. We publish papers all the time, not only on interventional trials, but also on new algorithms we create. And we even publish data on things that don't go the way we expect. We're about to have a couple publications coming out on interventions we thought would help, but actually ended up hurting. And so we publish both negative and positive data.
And so when has that happened, where you actually get data that is not what you expect? When has that happened, and what were the specifics of that, for example?
Yeah, so we're going to be releasing this paper in a few weeks. So I'm bearing the lead here just a little bit, but
no, that's okay. I'm sorry. I don't
it's quite fine. I'm happy to share. But we did a pretty small trial on what we call senolytic. And for those of you who don't know, sometimes as we get older, our cells go into this process we call senescence. Some people call them zombie cells, but they're cells that sort of pause and start secreting a lot of inflammation. Sometimes this inflammation is called inflammaging as a process, because it really encourages a lot of negative aging outcomes. But those cells accumulate as we get older, and have been highly linked to processes like osteoarthritis or cardiovascular disease. And so a big anti-aging treatment strategy has been to clear these from the system. And you can do this in a variety of ways. There are peptides, for instance, like FOXO4-DRI, people might be familiar with, or there are other nutritional supplements like Bizatin or goldenrod extract. But we actually chose for our study a combination of dasatinib, which is a cancer drug that's been used off-label to treat senescence, and we also use quercetin, which probably many people are familiar with as a sort of a botanical ingredient. And we use that over the course of a year and a half in some patients, tracked them over 5 different time points. And we recently saw that actually all of their biological age markers got a little bit worse. Their telomere length decreased. Their biological aging increased by most of these really good algorithms. And we were really, really surprised by that. We did see markers of senescence being reduced, so we knew it was acting like a senolytic, but by somehow doing that, it was also increasing people's biological age. And so that was definitely a surprise.
So how do you deal with that when you get that result, and now you're faced with communicating the result to the consumer and to the medical world? How do you deal with it?
Publication, number one. We want the data to be widely available and peer reviewed. We also, I would say, want to make sure that we understand our restrictions and restraints. I am not by any means saying that people should never use a senolytic or think about using senolytics. I'm just saying that in our trial, these senescent protocols were associated with increases in these clocks. And so how that impacts people clinically is still a question to be determined. There are many studies which have shown that senolytics improve health span and lifespan and improve certain disease traits. We just got conflicting data in this one instance. And so I think you never want to overreact too much, but hopefully more data is better. And as people start making these decisions about what to do in their own health, or as physicians start deciding how to treat their patients, this can be another piece of evidence which they can weigh in their decision-making process.
Well, I certainly applaud you for being so honest with the people that are most dependent on your testing or your research. That this would be something that possibly could be hidden if you were a pharmaceutical company. I'm not going to denigrate directly, but I think a lot of these studies that we read about in that world, in the allopathic world, very often they're studies that are being done by people who have a bias, and that would certainly be said of you, but yet you're telling the truth. So congratulations for being so honest.
Well, I think that's another important point as well, is that we make an effort not to sell any products to fix this process. We really want to focus on the best way to measure the process of biological aging and other epigenetic ways to interpret data for health outcomes. We don't ever want to turn it into a way to sell more of our own product. And I think that we're probably the only epigenetic age company out there that takes that approach. Most people would usually pair it with supplements, or while I don't think that that necessarily is a bad thing in and of itself, it does breed some of that conflict of interest that you mentioned.
Mm. Well, they say truth will set you free, right? So truth in everything is always the best course. But so talk to me and us, our viewers today, about aging, that aging really does matter. There's a few statements that, have been certainly well publicized, that all aging starts in the cells and that aging is a disease. So could you take those two statements and define what TruDiagnostic's perception is of those two generalized statements that are out in the media?
Yeah, so I think I'll tackle aging as a disease because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think that the FDA and the U.S. government has not necessarily labeled it as a disease, but they still give a lot of funding to age-related conditions. So, for instance, the National Institute of Health has a division called the National Institute of Aging, which is meant to help solve some of these issues that increase as we age. And so I think that they're certainly recognizing it as an issue, even though they're not quite sure how to define it yet. Even groups like the World Health Organization now have added diagnosis codes, where now someone can be diagnosed with a certain disease that is a result of aging. So, for instance, diabetes is a result of aging. So I think that we're starting to, both just socially and even in our political systems, start to even realize the impact of aging on a much wider level. And that's great. I think that definitely is more consistent with what we think, which is that, aging is a process which can certainly be mitigated and improved. And so we certainly think that. I also think that, as aging happens on the cellular level, I think that that is sort of what we're measuring, is we're measuring the DNA within inside the cells, and we know that that correlates to outcomes. And so I certainly think that that is also comparable. And so I would say that, again, it's a wide debate of whether aging is a disease, but I think that the answer would be, in my opinion, yes. And it's because it's something that we can mitigate and improve as we get older, and we can quantify that process. Whether or not we can ever reverse aging 100%, whether we can live forever, I don't know. I don't think at all it's anytime soon. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We shouldn't try to find ways we can improve that process. There are some people who talk about something called the longevity escape velocity. This is where our ability to sort of treat aging is going to exceed our aging rate, so that we might be able to live 200 years or even more, essentially forever, with improved biological processes. And I think we're a long way from that, but there are amazing things that are happening in the field of aging that I think people should be aware of. One of these things is called cellular reprogramming. And for people who are not familiar with this is where they use technology that won a Nobel Prize in 2012, called Yamanaka factors. And these Yamanaka factors are able to actually reset these epigenetic clocks to zero. They're actually able to reverse these epigenetic clocks entirely. And there have been several studies, including one notable one at Harvard, where they've been able to use these reprogramming growth factors to reset these epigenetic clocks, and in doing so, restore vision to mice who had been blind due to age-related vision problems. And so we're getting to where we can make some amazing changes, restore vision, I should say, from blind mice, which is really, really cool. And so this field of aging biology is a very hot topic, I think, in the zeitgeist, but also in the medical research field. There is so much emphasis now on this as a technology and a way we can improve health, because aging is such a big part of the disease. And I know we've talked about this previously, but I want to emphasize it again. It is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death. And so if there's one thing, if you're a healthy person and you want to have the best impact on your health, try and treat your aging as a primary outcome. because it's probably the best thing that you can do. And this dwarfs even things that we know are really bad, like smoking and obesity. Most people know those things are very bad for you. But aging is 5 times or 6 times the relative risk of even some of those conditions.
That's so important what you're talking about. And, those are controllable factors too, that everybody can take responsibility for their own choices. And those choices are going to affect the outcome. And you mentioned the senescence factor, the senolytics, and the fact that the cells do age, but they age with influences. It's not just an absolute number. It's an influence by what you choose to do in everyday life. So what are those factors? You mentioned smoking, drinking, alcohol, diet, stress. What are some others that you would put in that list?
Yeah, so really everything plays an impact, and what these epigenetic clocks have been able to tell us very early on are quite frankly not too surprising. They're things that we already know. And again, I don't think that is a bad thing. I think it is a good thing because it's not conflicting with all the data that we already know is beneficially affecting health span. So again, some things that this has told us is obviously things like smoking and drinking are bad. Most people would probably know that. It's also shown us that physical activity is very good for us. Staying active as we get older. It's even showed us, I would say, things that are a little bit harder to quantify, like our relationships and the quality of our relationships play a massive impact. Even we've even seen in our internal data set correlations to sexual activity and sexual satisfaction improving some of these markers or being correlated with some of these markers. And so there's a whole host of things that depend on this, and that's really what this tool allows us to do, is to really quantify those in a measurable fashion. So we can say, if you're going to do one thing, it is to stop smoking. That's the biggest priority. Or, hey, the next big thing you want to do after that is to improve insulin sensitivity, improve your metabolic health. And so we can sort of set priorities on what everyone should do. And so we're finding out a lot of these things. And sometimes we have surprising information that we wouldn't expect. As I mentioned with the senolytics, that's a good example. We also have found that in our really, really good athletes, like our Olympians or our professional athletes, sometimes they actually have worse aging than some of their counterparts because they're exercising too much and putting their bodies under a little bit too much stress sometimes. So it's really fun to see these types of associations. A lot of the early work has not been too surprising, but we're starting to find a lot of things that now, as we get more detailed, like the senolytics, which are becoming really exciting. We have another study that's coming out very soon with Stanford, which is looking at vegan diets versus omnivore diets, and sort of comparing which one is better. Here they looked at twins. So they took a pair of twins, identical twins. They put one twin on an omnivore diet, one twin on a vegan diet, and then compared their aging rates over the course of 8 weeks. And we didn't think that we would see a ton of difference at all because it was only an 8-week trial intervention. But still across multiple epigenetic clocks defined not only by us, but other individuals, all showed that the vegan diets had a slight preferential benefit in aging compared to the omnivore counterparts. And so that was surprising for us. And again,
wow, that's a big one.
Yeah,
a lot of people would dispute that because they're omnivores, right? So they don't believe that I mean, they believe that their diet is the best as long as you're eating grass-fed and organic, but you're getting your B12 and protein so to think that a vegan diet could actually be superior.
Yeah, definitely.
If you break that down, Ryan, what would be the reason that a vegan diet would be superior?
Yeah, so that's the next question we're trying to answer, is the why of it. And quite frankly, the studies like this should always be taken in context. I think studies like this, the one that we did in particular, were surprising, but they also have limitations which maybe impact its application to every individual. For instance, some of the twins we had in this study were at relatively younger middle age. And so whether or not this vegan diet would hold out to older age groups, maybe in in their 70s or 80s, where they might be experiencing more muscle loss and less protein, for instance. That might not be the same case. And so every study has limitations, but I think that these trends are starting to accumulate evidence, and as they start to accumulate more and more evidence, they can push us in the right direction. And so I think that one of the reasons that we were speculating that this vegan diet had a beneficial change was probably because of some of the micronutrients or the microbiome changes that were involved with some of these diets. But 8 weeks is a very short intervention time as well. Most people wouldn't say that 8 weeks of anything could drastically change their health behaviors. And so again, it's worth taking with some of those caveats. But I think that as this data grows, we're going to be able to pull on those threads a little bit more. So we can sort of ask the questions exactly like you did. What part of this is most beneficial to this aging phenotype?
Yeah, because every body is different. Their biochemistry is different. So it's really hard to to generalize about which diet approach is best, because it's different people have different biochemistry that would be responsive in different ways. So I think that would be a really difficult conclusion to come to. So Ryan, if you wanted to access TruDiagnostic algorithm, or become a client, a user, what is the steps? I mean, how do you do it? What is the method by which you measure? How does the patient or the client get you what you need in order to diagnose what they need?
Yeah, so this is also another important point, which makes us a little bit different than some other companies in the space, is because we only use blood as a tissue method. And this is important because every cell is different in its epigenetic expression, as we've already talked about, right? Epigenetically, your heart's expressing a lot of different genes than your skin. And so with that being said, tissue type is important, and most of these algorithms have been created off of one tissue type, which is blood. And so we only use blood in our analysis to make sure that it's consistent with the studies and published data. So for us, we ask for a blood sample, but with that being said, our blood sample collection is very, very easy. If someone wanted to do this testing, we could order it on our website. We could send it to them, and then they would just prick their finger for a couple drops of blood and put it on a dried blood spot card. I actually have one here. I'm taking my sample this morning. And I have one right there. This is what it looks like. We just need one of the circles filled with blood. That's not enough blood. You need a little bit more than that. And then they can send it back to us, and we get an analysis within 3 weeks. The other beautiful thing about, I would say, our platform is that as our ability to analyze this data becomes more robust, we actually update data that has been taken even from 3 years ago. Right now we're adding new algorithms to our platform to quantify physical performance, things like your VO2 max or your grip strength or your walking speed. And we'll be updating that for anyone who's done a test with us over the past 3 years. I think that for anyone who wants to do the test, it's a relatively simple process, a few drops of blood, and then you send that back to us in a simple envelope, and we do the analysis.
Well, I know that when I did mine, which I am really excited to hear the results in another week or two, but when I did that, I had trouble filling up that circle. I did it at a lab with a phlebotomist so that I could make sure that I got it right, but he had trouble. So what if you don't have enough, the blood doesn't fill up that circle? Can you still do the test?
Yeah. Well, so we need enough DNA to do the analysis, and if we don't have enough DNA, we might have to recollect. But we do have other methods to collect DNA or for blood that are sometimes easier. They tend to be maybe a little bit more expensive, but we have ways that are painless collection devices. You can even just slap onto your arm. I have a few of them behind me, and it collects enough blood that you can send back to us very easily. I think they're an additional $30, but they're very easy to do. You just press one button, stick it on your arm, press one button, and it collects enough blood. If you are also afraid to prick your finger, these can be a really good method as well, because they're virtually painless. Our website is TruDiagnostic.com. That's TRU Diagnostic, no S on diagnostic. So TruDiagnostic.com. You can also email me directly if you have any questions at ryan@trudiagnostic.com, or you can reach our support team. They might be a little bit quicker at getting back to you at support@trudiagnostic.com. We're happy to answer any of your questions, provide you documentation, or answer, I would say, anything within the process. And Michelle, I know that one of the things we really wanted to do for anyone listening on this podcast was to offer a way to even discount some of this testing. And so we did create a 20% off code. If someone goes onto our website and uses the promo code Michelle20, they'll be able to get an additional 20% off as well.
That is so sweet of you and generous, and we really do appreciate that, because we want people to be aware that, I think the test is $4.99 if you're just coming in directly, and if you come in through the Michelle 20 code that Ryan has so generously offered for the first-time users, you get a 20% off of that $500 price. So that's $100 savings, right?
Definitely, and we'll keep that open. I think for a couple months in case anyone wants to use it. We do recommend always retesting as well. Oftentimes people will always ask us what's the frequency we recommend that testing, and we say no more frequently than every 6 months. We really like enough time to go by in that testing to make sure that we're actually seeing real biological change instead of just noise in the measurement. And so we say at least 6 months, and we'll keep that code open for 6 months or so, just in case anyone would ever want to retest as well.
So what are some of the interventions that you would recommend to people to basically get that 7-year biological age, if that's a target number for everyone to start with? Reductions, so that they have a biological age 7 years younger than their chronological age. That's kind of the target number that you mentioned. So what are some of your favorites for improving your biological age?
Yeah, certainly. I think, and really easy to get into to perform. The number one of which would be caloric restriction. I know it's not a fun topic, but eating less calories than you're burning is one of the most well-validated interventions across multiple species for health span and lifespan extension. And there was actually a study published by some of our collaborators who created one of our algorithms, the Dunedin PACE algorithm, that they showed over the course of a 2-year caloric restriction study, right around 11%. So these people were, taking the amount of calories they burned per day, and basically multiplying that times 0.9, and that's how many calories they were eating per day. And over the course of that 2 years, they had reductions in their biological age. And so that is a tried and true method that we say would work for everyone, and it's actually not expensive. It's just actually less expensive than your current behaviors. And so it's
eating less.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So what role would you say intermittent fasting has in your protocol?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't know yet. What we do know is that what we have measured in that particular study was just the overall amount of calories. In terms of when and you're consuming those calories, we're not quite sure. And so I think that it's still, we need more work to be done there. But with that being said, I think that we're really excited to see where that goes. One other intervention that I would say everyone could benefit from, and it plays a major impact in some of these algorithms, is stress reduction. This is something that I can even relate to, that has helped me. Stress plays a major impact in some of these different conditions, and just mitigating your stress can play a major impact.
So does cortisol measurement come up in your DNA methylation results, so people know what their stress level is?
So it hasn't yet, but actually it's funny you mentioned that, as we just create a predictor of cortisol in some of our cohorts, and so we hope we might be able to add it soon. But we do know that a lot of those cortical signaling genes play an impact, and actually, even things like PTSD and depression all show high associations with increased biological aging, and so mitigating some of those high stress, sort of bad neurological environments even can play a major impact in improving your biological age. And again, those are things that everyone can do. I think beyond that, there are a couple other things like supplements that are very accessible, like vitamin D, for instance, has been shown in multiple studies to improve biological aging. We also see a really good trend with other things like DHEA, for instance, sort of one of those hormone metabolites or precursors that tends to diminish as we get older, but with supplementation shows some improvements in biological age. And so those are some other, I would say, tried and true methods that really, really work.
What would you say is the optimum level in your blood of DHEA and vitamin D25?
Yeah, so unfortunately, with the biological age studies, we didn't directly quantify the measure in blood. What we did is we actually took patients who supplemented with these protocols and then measured their before and after change. And both for the DHEA as well as the vitamin D, they saw improvements. So we're not quite sure what the optimal level is within your blood. That would certainly be a study we'd love to do, and are actually working on. But at the moment, we do know that generally supplementation tends to help.
Mm-hmm. So what about peptides? I know you started in that world, and of course the peptides have gone to another whole level of complexity, particularly as we had Dr. Bill Laurence on, and I know you worked together last week, and he talked about the peptide bioregulators, which is a different subcategory of the peptides in that they are amino acids, not synthetic. And I know you started out with, the BPC 157, the PT 141, all of those are all well and good and much more established. How do you feel about the peptide bioregulators out of Russia as a protocol that you would recommend to people?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data yet. But as you mentioned, Bill Laurence is doing amazing work there, generating such a robust data set with so much great data that I'm really excited to do some of these big meta-analysis with him and hopefully publish in the very near future. But at the moment, we're sort of blinded to some of that data.
Oh, okay. So this is so new. This is so new that anybody who wants to jump in is getting into a field that you at TruDiagnostic, where a lot of this data is assembled and diagnosed and deciphered for the outcome for the best benefits for biological age reduction. So you're still in the research phase of that but you are interested in obviously finding some answers, because this is, in Russia, they've been using these for 40 years.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think the U.S., we're just becoming aware of them. But you can't go on the internet now without having at least 5 or 6 podcasts and other means of communication on this field of peptide bioregulators. So thanks to Bill Laurence and Phil Mickens in London with Aging Matters, and he's been a guest on our podcast as well. So actually, you becoming a guest on our podcast was the result of those 2 people, and also Dr. Graham Simpson, who has been one of your huge fans and advocates. So so we're very, very happy that you've come today to give us the beginnings of an awareness of something that will basically be a tool. If you want a tool chest, look at TruDiagnostics as a way to begin your process of understanding how to control your understand first what your aging is, and then once you have the parameters, know how to deal with the improvement. So, Ryan, thank you so much. We've run out of time. I'm really happy we finally got this talk with you. And what I'd like to suggest is, as you get further along in some of these studies, that you keep in touch with me and that we have you back on so we can update people on some of the results and have another go at this, because this is a very fast growing and very, it's complex, but it can be simplified by people like you, so that people, the consumer, can understand what they need to do. So I really appreciate all your efforts in this very, very exciting field of anti-aging. So
Yeah.
thank you again for coming today. Is there anything that you would like to say just to sign off today and to our viewers?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Michelle, for having me. It's been wonderful to be on, and can't wait to be back, I think, with more information as we start to uncover it. And I hope that everyone really takes away the message that, aging is important, and you can impact your own aging progress. So hopefully we'll talk again soon. Certainly, if anyone wants to reach out to us directly, you can reach us at support@TruDiagnostic. That's TRU
Okay,
Diagnostic.
support. Okay.
Yeah, and if you'd like to order a test, you can go onto our website and use the promo code Michelle20, and that gets 1L in Michelle.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Forgot about that.
Definitely. And for 20% off, and if you have any other questions about the test, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and if they want to reach you to ask any questions, you're so available. It's Ryan at TRU Diagnostic without the S.com.
That's correct.
Very good. Okay, Ryan. Well, thank you again, and we'll be talking to you as we go along here. The next few months, we want to keep up with what you're doing. So thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate your time.
Okay, take care. Everybody have a beautiful day. This is Michelle Hughes signing off.